Very nice to meet you all. I'm Modwena Rees-Mogg, and I wrote a book on crowdfunding back in 2013 when things were, it was a bit of a case of write something with a great big guess and hope it came off. And so, but luckily most of the things I think I said made rough sense or were so general that I couldn't be blamed for what I was hoping for. And at the moment, amongst other things, I'm the co-founder of a business called Crowd Rating, and we believe very strongly that the crowd has views and opinions, but those views and opinions will be helped and enhanced by independent expert opinion. So we decided to set up a business, a friend and I, as a sort of ratings agency, starting with the equity crowdfunding market. And it's proved very interesting trying to create a data-driven analysis tool which enables us to rank and compare companies that are doing equity crowdfunding across many different platforms. And I think the good news is that overall we think the quality is good to excellent, which is good news for investors and therefore for entrepreneurs.
Cool. So I guess the first thing, to open it up to the floor, are there any questions to any of the individuals here? Yes, we have one just here. 1, 2, 3, 4th row up, just here. There's a gentleman.
Yeah, very good question. So to date we've had one full failure. I need that. I'm not even sure if it's working. So we've had one failure. There will be more, no doubt about it. I didn't cover that in the presentation, but we actually only work with high net worth and sophisticated investors, precisely because we want to work with investors that understand the risk of this type of investment. So in a way, we've approached it in a way that hopefully will reduce the risk to investors. It will allow them to invest with the professionals, sharing the risk and the reward. So some of them will fail, hopefully some of them will succeed. And it's a portfolio approach, which is what the professionals do anyway. But even then, we actually only work with people that understand the risk. So we have loads of other measures. We have, for example, a minimum of £1,000 to make sure you don't get enough people putting money that, they don't really think about it. £1,000 for most people is a fair amount of money. And that means that they think before they invest. And for us, that's absolutely crucial, is that they take it as an investment rather than a punt. Because if you get enough people putting, £100 and they don't really care about it, you start getting the wrong companies potentially funded.
But you're still making money.
I hope so. Yes, that's the idea as a business. Yeah. But we have no interest. So we sit in a longer term, right? As I was talking about it. If there's no return for investors, then my company will be done in 2 years, because then investors want return. So for me, it's much more about the longer term vision on, as I started with the slides straight away, sustainability for investors. Yes. If it's not sustainable for investors, we won't be here talking about it in 5 years' time.
I wonder if this has been part of the problem, actually. When we look at Rebus, so I know it's a slightly different platform, etc., but with Rebus and the Zano drone that went under a few months ago, have people got time? You've only got 90 days, and I'm guessing on your platform it's the same, 90 days to crowdfund or to pitch, 30 days, so it's even less. Is that time, okay, so you're investor-led, so there's probably a little bit of due diligence before they get to that stage as a filter, but is there time for the crowd to understand and conceptualize these visions that are being created when they get funded?
Yeah, I think Modwena will probably be able to talk about that quite a lot. I think there is 30 days is plenty of time to look at it. Actually, it's one of the beautiful things about crowdfunding is that companies don't have to wait for 3 months before they get the funding round, because they can start pursuing their customers rather than investors. And the customers are far more important than investors. You want to build a business to get customers, not investors.
Yeah.
Yes, I think there is firstly, there are different types of crowd investor. And I think that's something that's really important for people to understand. And then how you look after that investor does, by definition, have to be different. I think there's a more fundamental thing before even the different type of investor is that a lot of these investments are also sold because they have an EIS or SEIS tax break attached to it, which is a significant de-risker for the investor, not for the company and well the company will perform, but it means if the company succeeds, there are tax-free capital gains, and if it fails, there are tax breaks. But one of the interesting issues is, are investors actually going to claim the tax break? Because if you invest £100, are you going to go to the effort to filling in the form and sending it off to the taxman? And of course, even though you may be entitled to it, if you haven't claimed it, your risk profile is completely different to if you have. So that's something that people really need to understand, and it'll be interesting to see as the statistics come out whether people are actually claiming their tax breaks. So that's fundamental. Secondly, I think what Gonzalo said is absolutely right. There is a very different mindset to investing £10 or £100 to investing £1,000, or indeed for anyone, someone who says that's a meaningful sum of money. So, I mean, for some people, £10 is on some days of the month. I think £10 is quite a lot of money. But I do think, as a market, we have to think about this issue and try and form a view of what is a retail investor and what should they understand before they invest their £10. I'm going to assume the sophisticated people sort of know what they're doing. I mean, by definition, you shouldn't be mucking around, chucking money at things if you don't understand what you're doing, and you should take counsel from people who can help you make the right sort of decisions. But the £10 to £100 investor is somebody who's a really interesting individual. And to what extent do we need to think about how we look after that £10 investor? My view is information is knowledge. If you think about, people use the analogy of gambling and let's say the races just because it's easier. Lots of people pop down, have a great day out, stick 10 quid on a horse, and nobody thinks to say we've got to make that a regulated investment decision with even 30 days to make your decision, because it's understood that you are playing a game and you recognise you could well lose. But equally in that market there's an incredibly sophisticated system of odds, and actually the information provided if you want to put the money on the horses is incredibly comprehensive, of the horse, the dam, the sire, the number of races won, the jockey, etc. So the idea that there's an information vacuum when you're gambling is not true. It's just delivered in a way that the person who wants to put their money on the horse can understand and comprehend. And for me, that's one of the big issues around due diligence, is not so much that there is just due diligence in this amorphous area. It's actually how do you pinpoint the right issues and make sure investors can absorb that, so whether they invest £10 or $1 million, they understand the risks and rewards and issues and everything else.
That's great, yeah, the implications, yeah. Oh, we've got one just up there behind the balcony. Sorry, I can't really see the right side of my ear. It is.
Hi, Morwenna. I'm just wondering how you rate companies. I mean, obviously, you have certain criteria. It'd just be interesting to hear the criteria on how you rate crowdsource startups.
So we have, when we set up the business, we sat there saying, well, how do we know best? I mean, there's experience, and experience can be a good and a bad thing, because there's always the risk of personal bias. So we researched with VCs and angels sort of what questions do they ask. It seemed a sensible place to start. And we basically built we call it an engine, but it's basically about 90 questions. And they're basically based on facts. So I'll use a very simple example. When we look at the management team, we add up how many years of business experience they have, because some people have a lot, some people have less. We do believe that if you've had more business experience rather than less, you have more knowledge and understanding, therefore you are more likely to have more evidence upon which to make decisions in the future. But clearly there's a difference between just having business experience and then relevant business experience. So we also ask a question saying, well, within all that business experience you've got, how much of it actually is relevant to the business you're running today? And that may be sector, stage, whatever, functional skills. And we look for the evidence. And then we have basically preset scores based on the facts. So if you have, say, 100 years of business experience in the team, we believe that scores very highly. If you have 2 years, that doesn't mean those entrepreneurs aren't going to be brilliantly successful. And Mark Zuckerberg, you were right. But at the start, the people with more experience will be more knowledgeable about jeopardy than the youngsters. And sometimes some people may say, well, actually, you want the youngsters who know nothing because they're so fearless that off they'll go. So the questions are all basically around that area. But some of my favourite questions, and actually this is one which I'll sort of give you a little secret, but one of the things we look at is how much money do we think the entrepreneurs, the founders, the original shareholders before it's around, are actually going to take off the table on the day the company exits. Because we think that people's motivation changes depending on how much money they think they're going to make, because the definition of entrepreneurship is capitalism. You know, the point of doing this, of course, there's emotional satisfaction and creating something, all those things, but when push comes to shove, if you suddenly discover you're not going to make a bean, that is going to affect how you proceed in the future. And there's a lovely story one chap in the accountancy world tells me about a company that sold for £100 million, and I'd be interested how many of you know, have a guess how much the entrepreneur, the two founders between them, took off the table of that 100 million exit. Any other ideas? Okay, it was £600,000. Again, I think it's all about, isn't that shocking? And yet, what had happened is over time there'd be more rounds and dilution and this and that. And for all I know, they'd taken massively generous salaries, so their overall personal return might have been excellent. But prima facie, they did not achieve what probably they set out to achieve. And these are the sorts of things that it's really important. So we look at that and say, well, actually, if we even today think these people are only going to make 100 grand when the company eventually sells, that's, for us, that's quite a big negative, because even if they haven't realised it yet, one day they will, and that's going to affect their desire to make it a really big company and therefore generate return for investors.
That's really interesting. Yes? So we've got the motivation of both the entrepreneur and of the crowd themselves that are putting the money into it. Yeah. There's a question just on the end there. Sorry, am I avoiding other people? I can't really see all this light on my face. Sorry. I'm not being biased.
Hi, I've got a question for Chris Skinner, and it's in relation to banks and the nature of securities. So there seems to be a conflict between the fact that banks traditionally are so embedded in security practices, keeping people out. The nature of crowdfunding and open innovation is the opposite end. So you use the example of BBVA as a bank that seems to be leading the way in this space. What's your comments or thoughts on how that conflict has been managed successfully, and how, what's BBVA doing or other banks doing in better enabling open source innovation or open innovation given some of those security constraints?
Yeah, I mentioned BBVA's annual hackathon and open innovation days, and what they're doing is using APIs to see what innovations developers can take from their data. They make the data anonymous, so it's not actually revealing customer information. And the big deal for most banks is the borderline between keeping the customer safe and allowing open innovation. Exactly to your point. Most banks don't engage in social media for that reason, because they think it can jeopardize the conversation with the customer if something goes in public domain which shouldn't have been revealed in public domain. The way they're getting around it, the more visionary banks like Metro Bank here in the UK, for example, is by partnering. So Metro Bank partners with Zopa, so that if people want to invest in peer-to-peer lending, then they can do it through a savings scheme in Metro Bank's structure. Similarly, Fidor Bank in Germany partner with Smava as a peer-to-peer lender. Caja Navarro in Spain actually provide a crowdfunding platform that's managed on the bank's platform, so that you can feel safer investing in friends and family through their platform. So some of the banks are doing things that are reasonably innovative, but most of them are not, mainly because they want to be secure, managing risk, exactly to the point made. And it's liability at the end of the day, in that who's liable for losses? The bank's liable for losses, because that's what they give you as a guarantee, that they'll protect you up to €100,000 of savings, and if they lose it, they'll get it back for you. That liability and the risk that goes with that is the reason why they're not opening to the whole world. There are some, though, that are using technology to get more value out there. There's a great bank in the Ukraine called Privat Bank, which actually has something like 250 APIs on their homepage, accessible to plug and play into any part of any other operation. And that's where I think you start seeing differences. Very small banks doing very innovative things in a secure way because they understand the technology capabilities that are available today.
Brilliant, yeah. So that leads on to a question, actually, before... We were a bit worried it was going to be a bit flat and you weren't going to ask some questions. So together we emailed each other and we came up with a few. So if you don't mind, I'm going to choose one of these, if that's okay with everybody. It's competition or collaboration, really, and this came from our little discussion. What will the relationship between banks and platforms look like in a couple of years? So if we move forward 2, 3 years, what do you think the scene's going to look like, or the horizon going to be?
I think that the next 12 to 24 months are going to be absolutely fascinating because the banks are really, really waking up to it. I was at an event called Innovate Finance yesterday. 1,500 people attending, and a lot of people in grey suits, can guarantee you that. And but there are loads of top-tier banks there trying to understand what's going on, and they really struggle. We've had one quite some time ago. We had not that long ago, but some time ago, we had one of the top-tier banks approaching us, and they wanted to partner with us in one way or another. And we obviously, as a small company, get very excited about it, and I start talking, and you devote a lot of time to get there. This will be very interesting for you. And then eventually never really got anywhere because they said, the people on the other side of the bank, on the innovation team, were like, yeah, this is really exciting, sounds great, very cool, go ahead, do this, do that, do that, do that. And then the compliance team got involved. And they wanted to change our whole business, basically, to comply with the existing compliance rules. And that would have just killed us as a business. So we just said, look, I'm sorry. And I never thought I would turn a top-tier bank away. But I went, look, we're fed up of spending time with you guys trying to sort this out. There's no way this is going to happen. And they wanted to change even things that the FCA, FCA is authorized. Mm-hmm. The FCA had authorized the way we do it in the automated way, very, very efficient way. And that's what makes us so different in terms of fintech versus banks. And the bank went, oh, no, because our compliance team says that you need to change that. And hang on, your compliance team works because of the FCA. Yeah. So I think that the banks still have to learn a lot. They don't quite understand how fintech works, and they will be, but they're looking very hard to make it work.
I'll get a bit philosophical here, but what is a bank? So a bank's a place you store money. Bank's a place you get money from. There's some sort of transactional fee. There's a big service issue. But is PayPal a bank? I mean, you can store money in PayPal, and I think PayPal now offers some of the working capital thing, I think, so you can get money off PayPal. Is Apple a bank? So, it wouldn't surprise me if what are banks in 5 years' time are completely different sorts of vehicles and some of the big brand names. If you look what happened post-Napster to the music industry, think. There might be a reordering of the world about, what we think of as a bank. So if we look instead at people who provide money and collectively or gathering money, there's a lovely, did you know in sort of way back in ancient history, sort of the 18th, 19th century, if you're in rural England, the bank was actually the solicitor because they had a strong room. So you toddled over with your bar of gold and left it in the solicitors, and they said, okay, we'll pay you 2% a year. And you said, thank you very much. And they said, but I've got no cash. So the solicitor said, well, here you go, here's some cash to pay your bills, and we'll charge you 3%. Thank you very much. So I think that's really, and I think the banks have to really sit up and think about that issue, that they may not exist. And banks are also, there's the advisory side, so investment banks, merchant banks, that sort of concept, that gets close to, because the original merchant banks, they were sort of the original venture capitalists. So that's my thought for you to all share with me.
Brilliant. Thank you.
PayPal and others are actually sitting on top of the banking system at the moment. They could become banks, as is Apple Pay, sitting on top of the banking system. And that's an important point, that most of what we've seen so far with fintech and crowdfunding is either sitting on top of the banking system rather than replacing it, or offering an alternative business model that serves alternative customers. So if you take something like Sophie, which is the large lender in the States for students, social finance, their business model is based around targeting a demographic called Henrys, high earners, not rich yet. So they're students, but they're at Harvard, Ivy League schools. They know they're going to get great jobs. They give them a mortgage that they couldn't get for another 10 years in normal circumstances. That's a completely different business model with a completely different risk structure that a bank would never tolerate or take the risk, because they have to look after the interests of their deposit holders. And equally, banks are licensed to run a function that is very boring and regulated, and most of them will say if there's any innovation out there that they like, we can't do it because of regulation and compliance, exactly to your point. What I think will happen in the next decade is that you are going to see banks start to become value systems integrators, as I call them. And what I mean by that is that at the moment, the slides I skipped over this morning about the bank business model were based on the bank business model has a front, middle and back office. The front office has been completely changed by the Internet of Things and apps and mobile devices. The middle office is being completely changed by real-time APIs. And the back office is being completely restructured through shared ledger blockchain structures along with cloud and data analytics. And all the fintech startups are taking one piece of a bank's business in front, middle or back office and using those technology capabilities to create a new service that's very narrow focused. And what banks will end up having to do is viewing all the startups that are doing these pieces of innovation around their back, middle, front office as widgets downstream. And the bank therefore becomes an integrator of widgets, APIs, pieces that others are doing into their services, rather than allowing their service to be completely taken away from them by these companies. And that will get very interesting because you end up with a completely hybrid model where there will be some breakthrough unicorn structures like Stripe, but Stripe sits on top of the banking system and the card structures. And there will be some that will start to impact banks' businesses, and the banks will seek to partner with them probably or acquire them.
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Sorry, Chris, I thought that was really interesting. So if you don't mind, I'm joining you guys to ask a question, which is, number one, the only thing I disagree with everything you said is that it won't be in a decade. It will be far shorter than that. But my question is, why would companies like ourselves actually end up partnering with banks? Because then you're just adding intermediaries to the system again, whereas what we're trying to do is to remove as much inefficiencies from the middle. So, for example, if you imagine your slide with a bank website and all it does, and if you imagine that, for example, if a company wants equity funding, Syndicate Room allows them to go through the entire equity journey, one platform. If they want lending, they have other platform. They're very, very good at what they do. If they want asset-backed finance or invoice discounting, they have certain specific platforms that become very, very good at what that specific vertical. Why would they partner with banks when they have the power not to partner with banks, and not necessarily today, but in 2 years' time? And what's the future of banks then?
It's probably the reason why Cabbage and Funding Circle partner with Santander, which is that Santander can bring them customers, bring them liquidity, bring them volume. And the reason why Santander partner with them is that they don't want that business because it's not business that they can serve under their credit risk models, but they want to make sure that the customers served effectively as an SME. So refer them in a joint venture to Cabbage and Funding Circle. And so one of the big points that most of the banks will make is, and it came up regularly at conferences, every bank has millions of customers and thousands of staff. That's part of their problem, that they've got legacy staff and legacy customers. And how do you, therefore, innovate on the one hand to serve a new customer base, which may be partnering with someone like Syndicate Room, and for you get access to millions of customers that you didn't have access to otherwise. So it's a win-win for both sides. That's the model that's starting to appear.
So from the front. Can we get a microphone here? Is it okay? I really want to ask Giancarlo, did it feel good turning them down there?
Slightly scary, to be honest. Like, shit, are we doing the right thing here? Or?
Yeah.
It's not every day in the office, that's for sure.
All right. Maybe I'm totally in the dark here, but we started a company in Africa. It's called the Baobab Express. It's Africa Drive. And now the banks, it's in Belgium, they're coming to us to do a crowdfunding round. So we're going to the next country, which is in Senegal, and it's quite a social company. So we want to improve the ecosystem of mobility in rural Africa. We've proven that 2 years that we've got a model. Now the banks, via a partner, are coming to us to do part of our next round of fundraising with the bank. And I'm just leering you, and I'm not sure, why are they doing that? What is encouraging them to do that? Is it, maybe you can answer me that.
One of the most popular blogs that I wrote is called "The Best Job in Banking is Chief Cannibal Officer." And the idea being that you should destroy your company. And if you can destroy your company, at least you're going to build one that's going to survive based on the fact that you've re-engineered the business to be fit for the future. The only reason I mention it is that that banks have now started to invest in cannibalization. And their view is that, particularly the large banks like Citi, Deutsche, BNP Paribas, Lloyds even, and Santander and BBVA in particular, they have innovation funds with the view of let's build the next generation of banking, because if we invest in building the next generation of banking, then at least we own that's part of that next generation of the system. You know, if you look at Barclays run a quarterly meeting with my Financial Services Club, it's a network that is in UK and across Europe, which if you're interested, fsclub.net, please join. And Barclays run a quarterly meeting in Whitechapel, which is not where you think Barclays would have an innovation centre, but that's on the Silicon Roundabout. And the accelerator is all focused on startup fintech and blockchain companies and nurturing them through tech mentors and giving them free access to resources to get through early stage seed investment into growth. And nearly all those companies then end up being partners with Barclays, which is why Barclays is doing it. The success of that has been so great that they're now replicating that in New York and in other centres around the world. And it is all about let's cannibalize our business through investing in those people who are creating new business models, and then A, see if we can incorporate or partner with those models, or B, if we can't, at least we own some of the model.
And I'll just respond. One of the side benefits was because, and this is KBC in Belgium, because they are willing to do this, also the rest of our current investors feel more confident because established players are also being part of the game. So
yeah. And in fact, the figures I put up about investing in fintech, $19 billion last year, $12 billion the year before, $4 billion the year before that. Of that investment, we're seeing about 20% is coming from the banks.
It's a lot, isn't it? Yeah. Guys, we're going to have to wrap up, but can we have a round of applause, please, for the panel?